And then they get involved with the fur trade with the natives. Okay? The fur trade was a great thing. The beaver pelts were very sought after in England for hats, and the deer hides as well were also sought after. In fact, at the height of the fur trade, a deer hide would actually go for about $1. And today we call $1 a buck, right? Makes sense? Okay. So we get involved with the fur trade, but then the English, they can't be left out, right? They want to get involved with the fur trade too. So they come over, a sailor who's actually sailing for the Dutch, but he's sailing for England, and he comes over kind of north of that area, and he establishes that bay, and his name was Hudson. So they call it Hudson Bay. So now he is actually doing the fur trade with the Iroquois. Now you can't have two different countries fighting over limited resources with the natives, so that leads to conflict, right? So we have the French-Indian War, we have the 7-Year War, right? And then eventually that leads to other problems. But when they established the area in Quebec, they called it New France. And that's important to remember, because we're going to visit that in a little bit, why they called it New France. Okay? So then, about 1700, the French say, we're in a lot of conflicts here, this is not worth it, let's go ahead and pull out of that area a little bit. Except for there was one French military leader who thought, I still want to be involved with the fur trade, it's still very sought after, and so what he did is he asked to put up one more fort over on the river that separates Lake Huron and Lake Erie, and France told him no. So he went to France and petitioned them, begged, I'm not sure what he did, and they said, okay, fine, you want to do one more fort, go ahead. So he built this fort on the river that connects Lake Huron and Lake Erie in Ontario. And the reason he wanted to do that is he wanted to stop the English, who were in the northern Great Lakes, from coming down into Lake Erie and Lake Ontario so they could continue their fur trade. So he calls this a fort, and eventually it turns into a village on the river, or village on the straits, or Ville des Toits en Français, right? And we know that today as Fort Detroit. Does anybody know who that French military leader was? His name was Anton Delamotte Cadillac. Right? You might recognize Cadillac as Cadillac Square, right? Or the car company, Cadillac, right? And again, he's there to protect Lake Erie and Lake Ontario so the French can continue to do the fur trade, not have to fight with the English over the resources. Now, why is this important? Because as you'll see, as Michigan is a territory and then becomes a state, most of the early settlers came through Detroit. And we'll talk about the Erie Canal, but they came through Detroit, and that was kind of the gateway into Michigan. And that's how you wanted to come through, that's the way you had to do it. And they would buy all their supplies and everything and then go off and homestead. So that brings us to the early 1800s, okay? Michigan is established as a territory in 1805 with a territorial council. Now the first territorial governor is a gentleman by the name of William Hall. Mixed reviews, some people liked him, most people hated him because he actually surrendered Fort Detroit to the British in War of 1812. That's not good for your reputation, okay? So he was out of there. So the second territorial governor is who we're going to concentrate on here, and his name was Colonel Lewis Cass, and you might recognize Cass as in Cass Avenue in Detroit, or Cass Tech High School, or Cass Lake, right? So he was second territorial governor in Michigan from 1813 to 1831, and he was actually tasked with one job, and that was to gain statehood for Michigan. Now, in order to gain statehood, you have to establish a certain amount of counties within the area, right, to grow it, to make it bigger. So he offered cheap land to new settlers who would come out here and homestead. But the issue is that Michigan had a wolf problem. It's not a problem for the wolves, but it was definitely a problem for the early settlers, because they would come in, and then the wolves would come down and eat their livestock and destroy their crops. Then they would send word where they came from and said, this is no good, I don't think you guys should come to Michigan, and that's not going to help grow the state. So Colonel Lewis Cass, Governor Cass, he establishes a hunting and trapping bounty for these wolves. So for every wolf pelt that you brought down to the territorial capital, which was in Detroit, obviously, before Lansing, he would give you $5. That was a lot of money in the 1830s. That's the equivalent to about $185 to $200 today. And so that was going to start bringing some more people in there to take care of the wolves. I did want to put this map up here. It's a map of circa 1800. Now, of course, the survey tools they had at the time were limited and not what the advanced stuff we have today. And here's Michigan, and as you can see, the thumb is much smaller than what it is today. And I'm not sure if they thought Higgins Lake and Houghton Lake were one and the same. But they made it middle of the state, one giant lake there. But anyway, it's neat to look at old maps and see how they saw the world at the time there as well. Now, who are the people that came here? If you visit any of the cemeteries in this area, whether it's Oxford, Lake Orion, Rochester, Romeo, what you will find are the earliest settlers, the oldest people in that cemetery who are buried there are typically from the East Coast. Now, why is this? Because in 1817, the Grand State of New York began construction on the Erie Canal, a one-shot shipping channel from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Great Lakes. So on this map here, down in the corner, you'll see the ocean kind of in the corner, and you come up the Hudson River and you get to Albany, and you head west on the Erie Canal all the way to the east side of Lake Erie. Well, why not to Lake Ontario? It's even closer. Because the elevation difference, right? Because you have Niagara Falls, that big elevation difference, they'd have to traverse. They wanted a channel they didn't have to do that in. So you take the Erie Canal, and once you got to the east side of Lake Erie, then you can take these big old steamer ships all the way to Detroit, and then you buy your supplies, purchase your land, and go out and homestead. Now, to give you an idea of how integral this was to the growth and development of Michigan. In 1817, there were approximately 9,000 settlers in Michigan, not including the French fur trappers and not including the natives that were here, okay, because the leftover French from Fort Detroit. In 1825, the Erie Canal is completed, and by 1830, there are more than 33,000 new settlers. So these big steamer ships, William Penn was a steamer ship, they could bring over hundreds of people at a time, and that really helped the growth of development of Michigan. Now, when the people got here, they went out into the territory and they built towns and villages all along the way. Typically, they would name them after two things. One, where they came from, New France, right? Or two, they would name them after themselves. Can anybody guess where the settlers of Rochester, Michigan came from? Rochester, New York, and the same with Utica, Troy, Birmingham, Almont, Attica, and all the names of villages that already existed in New York and New Jersey and the East Coast, they came here. If you made it familiar, that would encourage other people to come. You know, we're from Rochester, oh, we're from Rochester, Michigan, and it was kind of a familiarity type of thing, okay? So the Erie Canal was integral in developing and growing the state of Michigan. Now we get to who was the first person to live in Oxford. Now Lake Orion was already established, Romeo was already established. The first person to come to Oxford was a gentleman by the name of Avery Brown. He was from Chili, New York, which is just southwest of Rochester, New York. He came to Oxford in 1831 to basically take the bounty money, the hunting and trapping, and make the $5 per wolf until he moved to the cedar swamps in Oxford. This is a map of 1800. This area up here, the cedar swamps, north of Meyer. If you're familiar with Oakwood Road, there's Horseshoe Lake right there, and that's kind of left over from those cedar swamps. So he sets up in the cedar swamps, and he is hunting and trapping wolves, but what he doesn't realize is that wolves are actually very smart animals, and you can't get close enough to hunt them, so he would set traps, and then he'd go around each day and check those traps. So in the meantime, he knew that settlers were coming behind him, people were purchasing property, and so that he started making cedar wooden shingles for homes. So he could sell them to people in Rochester and Romeo, and the cedar shingles were really conducive to the harsh Michigan winters. He knew people were coming, so he started stockpiling them and making them. This down here, as you're not surprised, this is not a real photograph of Avery Brown, okay? Downtown Oxford, we have a brewery called the Homegrown Brewery, and they have a dark ale, a brown ale called the Avery Brown Ale. And so when you order it on the menu, it's got a little side note that tells you the history of the first hunter-trapper that lived in Oxford. He didn't purchase property, so I wouldn't call him a settler, but he did live here first in the cedar swamps, and that's what they use on their beer can. So I thought it was kind of neat, so I threw that in there. I want to point out two things on this map of 1818. This is Stony Lake. So when people come into the museum and say, Stony Lake is a gravel pit and my granddaddy dug it, well, we know that's not true because here it is in 1818, long before the gravel industry came to Oxford. The second thing I want to point out is this line right here that kind of runs down the center of it, and at the bottom it's labeled right here. It's called Indian Path. That today is M24. Okay. Back in the day, M24 was a two-track that connected the tribes in Flint and in Pontiac. And the early settlers that came here that we're going to talk about, they actually saw these natives walking on that path on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, and they write about them in their journals, and there's some funny stories in there. But so that was actually a two-track that connected them. That's called Indian footpath, right? So who was the first person to purchase property and live in Oxford? The very first settler, the very first Oxford resident is a gentleman by the name of Elbridge Jerry Deming. Born in Vermont in 1800. As a young man, after 4 years of marriage, his wife passed away. So he moved to the west, and he actually ended up in Chi-Li, New York, and became friends with Avery Brown, right? There he met Sally Phillips. Here's a picture of Sally Phillips. Very friendly looking very happy, homesteading, right? And then they move, they actually purchased property. They actually purchased the first land property was sold from the Territorial Council in 1823, and they moved to Oxford in 1832. And at first they moved to the cedar swamps, and they live with Avery Brown in his cabin while they kind of get settled. Miss Deming took care of the cabin, and then the gentlemen, Elbridge and Avery Brown, they kind of hunted and trapped wolves and made the cedar shingles together until Mr. Deming built his first cabin 300 yards west of where Avery Brown was. And that area today is actually M24 and Metamora Road. And so since he was the first person to purchase the property, he could call that little establishment whatever he wanted to. And so what did he call it? Demingsburg, after himself, right? How they named towns back then. And so Demingsburg are the grassroots. That's kind of the beginning of where Oxford actually started, okay? So in 1832, he moves here. 3 months after, you have the next settlers in Oxford who purchased property, and that is John and Fight Rossman. And the Rossman family is in here tonight, so I'm going to try to get these facts straight, okay? So the Rossmans were the second ones to move here, but Elbridge Deming moves here in 1832, in the spring of 1832. In 1834, he establishes his log cabin as the first post office, and he would go to Rochester and bring the mail up by horseback, and he becomes the first postmaster of Demingsburg, or the grassroots of Oxford. But by 1836, John and Fight Rossman, as well as the Axford brothers, if you're familiar with the road Axford, they decided that they wanted more of a level, kind of a downtown area, more of a business district. They want something a little different. Demingsburg is kind of Elbridge Deming's area. They want their own four corners. So they start calling it Oxford Four Corners. Now in 1837, the same year Michigan becomes a state, Oxford becomes a township, followed by the incorporation of the village in 1876. Now before that, Oxford, Orion, Addison, they were all a part of Oakland Township. But Michigan becomes a state, and they all break off and become their own municipalities, okay? Now, how did Elbridge Deming become the first person to purchase property in Oxford? Was he waiting in line somewhere? Did he hear about it in the paper? How did he know about that? And just recently, another historian here, Mr. Darrell Lambertson and I were at the museum doing some research, and it turns out that as a young boy, he actually joined the military and served in the War of 1812. And so after that, he served there, he was actually granted some property in the territory of Michigan, wherever he wanted it. And then he put together some of his money and bought more property, and that's how he was the first person to purchase property, because he had that land grant. So Elbridge Deming has some pictures up here, and afterwards, if you want to look at the pictures, and there's a little story, but it's some more of his family here. And I know I tease Miss Deming, she's a lovely woman, but I will note that people ask the museum all the time, like, well, how come nobody smiled back in the days? Because they were sad, or because they had bad teeth? And the answer is the aperture, or the speed of the camera, right? It would take several minutes. So if you were to smile, and then you're holding it, and then you don't smile, and then you smile again, your face would be all blurry. So you had to keep, they just didn't smile, so you could just get a nice, clean, crisp photo. There's actually stories of family reunions where they would have to take kids and put a post in the ground and belt them to the post so they didn't move. Otherwise, they'd be all, they'd be all blurry in there, trying, moving around. And stop moving. Nothing changes these days, I tell you. Right? So what was Oxford like when the first settlers came here? Well, in 1813, land surveys of the Congress of the New Union of the United States said that only 1 in 1,000 acres were good for anything, including cultivation. So basically it was swampy, as you can see in the photo there, impenetrable, unpassable, not very good. So it was terrible for farming, right? Well, it kind of was and it kind of wasn't. It turns out that over time, as these swamps began to evaporate and dry up, all the dead and decaying matter in it worked like nutrients and made the ground very fertile. So Oxford, like all other homesteading establishments, became an agricultural community. Okay, so here we are as an agricultural community. We specialized in apples, potatoes, and rutabagas, and at one time we produced so many rutabagas that Oxford gained the nickname as Bagatown. And we're going to talk about how that actually happened, right? So John and Fight Rossman are the second settlers in Oxford, and they come in, and they actually come from a lot of money. So they bought 170 acres, and again, less than $1 an acre, and they set up apple orchards. If you're familiar with Oakwood Road, when you go east of M24, on the north side, there's Rossman Lake. There you have it, right? The Rossmans had all that establishment, and they planted 170 acres of apple orchards. In fact, people come to the museum, had somebody not too long ago come in and say, we live up on Oakwood Road, and all our property is all apple trees, and we don't know why. And they're like, well, this is the reason why. But the problem with apples is you can only consume so much of it. Yeah, apple sauce, apple this, apple that, right? Only so much you can do. So a lot of it would go to waste. So Oxford actually had its own apple drying factory over on East Street, kind of back behind Burdick Street Equipment. And here's a picture from 1880 to 1890. And John Gardner started the apple drying plant. And what they did was the original apple dryers were just kind of wooden boxes, and they put a heating element of some sort, and they'd slice up apples and put them in there. And you don't want to make it too hot. You don't want to cook the apples. You just want to dehydrate them, right? So you get the moisture out of them. And then you could store them, you could ship them, you could, obviously store them for a lot longer. And then, like instant potatoes or instant rice, you just add water and voila, you got great apples, right? This is a farm down here, the Hickmott Farm over on Noble Road, and this house was just recently tore down in the last 3 weeks, unfortunately. But it's another farm that's been around a long time. And this picture here was taken last fall, and this is the north side of Oxford, to kind of show you that there's still farming community here in Oxford, as there is in a lot of places in Michigan. So it's still plotted out. We still do a lot of corn and soy. There's still a lot of farming going on in the north side of Oxford. This, somebody asked me about here, this is a gravel pit, right? And this beautiful teal or aqua color. If you go down to the Caribbean, right, and you dip a glass into the water and you pull it out, it's clear, right? What you're actually seeing is the reflection and the refraction of light that hits the bottom, hits the white sand, and comes back up and gives it that beautiful teal color. That's not related to this, but I just thought I'd point that out. So Oxford is big in agriculture, as all farming and homestead communities were. Nobody took the Erie Canal over looking for a job. And there were no jobs. Nobody lived here, right? They all came over to purchase property and to set up their homes and their farms and begin homesteading. Okay. Now, how did Oxford become Bega Town? I mean, how can you produce so many rutabagas that somebody would know you? And that's because of this gentleman right here. His name was Charles Lee Ray Randall. He came to Oxford in the 1870s, just after the trains arrived, and he is rumored to be the first millionaire in Oxford, okay? So to give you an idea, in 1898, he purchased $750,000 of local produce from all the local farmers in the area. And that's equivalent to about $25 million today. And of course, the farmers loved him because he was giving them security. They didn't have to worry about their product going bad. He was buying everything they could, and he used the power of the train to ship it all over the country. According to the Oxford Leader at this time, the firm of C.L. Randall was the second largest produce dealer in the United States and, quote, well known by all the states in the Union. So Charles Lee Ray Randall, very respected community leader. He was the third president of the Oxford Savings Bank and was the president when he passed away. He was also on the School Board of Education for 40 years, so well-loved, well-respected. Now, if you're familiar with this house here, as many of you probably are, over on West Burdick Street, this is a 6,500 square foot Dutch colonial that he built starting in 1894 and finished completing in 1900. But what I want to point out to you is that the first floor and the foundation are made with all this beautiful fieldstone. And where did he get that? When all the local farmers found out that he was building a house in town, they brought him all their best fieldstones to use in the project of building his home. And that was a common thing back in the day. If you're familiar with St. Joseph Catholic Church, all that beautiful fieldstone, same thing. It came from all the local farmers. So Charles Lee Ray Randall. Now there's question as to who designed this house. One account says it was Joseph Mills, a well-known architect in Detroit, but the family insists that it was built and designed by Albert Kahn, another familiar name for architects in Detroit. We don't know for sure because it's not written down, but either way, I think we can agree that it's an absolutely beautiful house. My favorite part is a little carriage house right here with the door up high. So when the carriage comes through, you can get right out and go right inside the house. So very, very important person. And of course, with the trains, he was able to ship produce all over the country. So let's talk about those trains real quick. Okay? The trains came to Oxford. In 1872 was the Detroit and Bay City Railroad, which eventually became Michigan Central Railroad, or the New York Central, the Penn Central, and then eventually the DUR, the Detroit United Railway, was the electric trolley that came to Oxford, and that was huge in the development and growth of Oxford and the surrounding communities. Okay, so how did all these trains get their? How did they get all the tracks or all the property to put the train tracks on? Well, after the Civil War, we went through what was called a long depression. Now, it was spurred on by the Panic of 1873, which was a run on the banks in Europe, which kind of spread over to the United States. There were a lot of other factors that kind of played into that, like United States demonetized silver and things like that. So there's a lot of other factors, but because of that, farms were not producing as much as they would before. So typically that does happen after a war. You might have a little depression or a recession. And so they donated a lot of property because they knew that trains were the latest and greatest technology. And if you were on the train track, you could be very, very successful. To give you an idea, all the farmers in North Oxford and Metamora had to get all their crops onto carts and wagons and buggies and take them all the way down to Oxford, which if you're going slow with oxen, it's a long process, to Oxford to get them on the trains to ship them. So Mr. Thomas donated property to bring a depot in. Now, if you're going north on M24, north of Oxford, on the east side or right side, you will see Thomas Road. And that is, if you go on Thomas Road, you'll have 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street. And that's because that was a thriving community back in the 1800s, the village of Thomas. Same with Baldwin Road. If you take Baldwin Road north, all the way up where it dead ends as far as the pavement is, at Oakwood Road. There's a party store in the southeast corner, and that's it. There's some houses and a party store. That used to be the incorporated village of Oakwood, and that was a thriving community, much bigger than even Oxford. But on May 25th, 1896, an F5 tornado, the largest tornado ever recorded in Michigan until the 1950s, the Beecher in Flint. That was the largest tornado ever. It came through from Holly area all the way out to Dryden and took out both of those communities. Both of them were wiped out. Now, because Thomas was on the railroad depot, they were rebuilt because it was easy to bring in building supplies and lumber because they're right on the train. Oakwood was not rebuilt because you'd have to bring all the supplies over by horse and cart and wagon, and they just did not rebuild it. So to give an idea of how important it was, if you were on the railroad tracks, you were going to be successful. If you weren't, it was like being on Radiator Springs and Route 66, if you get the Cars reference. You're kind of left behind, right? And so that's the reason why. So the trains were also very integral and very a big part of growing and developing of Oxford. Now I'm going to move into not the gold rush, but what I like to call the stone rush. And I know you're all familiar with the stone rush here in Oxford. So we go to the end of the last glacier, right about 12,000 years ago. And the Laurentide ice sheet's moving its way down over top of North America, crushing millions of tons of bedrock, filling up the Great Lakes. When it melts and recedes back, Oxford happens to sit on top of a sand and gravel deposit, or a sand and gravel vein, okay? And that is what starts the gravel industry here at the turn of the 20th century. And this is the first gravel operation, the Detroit and Oxford Sand and Gravel, where Meyer sits today. It was American Aggregates again. And down here we have Koenig. Many people call it Koenig, but it is Koenig, a German family and the family's here in the room as well, so make sure I'm saying it right. But they're over here on Lakeville Road. So who started all this? This man right here. He was the first gravel baron in Oxford, and his name was William O. Smith. He was born and raised on his father's farm on Seymour Lake over in Brandon Township. He came to Oxford in 1910, and he rented property from the Van Wagner family, from Van Wagner Pharmacy, the big farming community around here. And the property he rented was an 87-acre parcel, and it kind of goes from the fire station in town, and then goes up M24, and over to Ray Road, and this is North Oxford Road, and then kind of came back down this way. This was the 87-acre parcel that and what he would do is he was bringing the field stone from the farmers, and he would crush it up, and then he would sell it. It's not a huge industry at the time. What are you going to use it for? Well, three things basically. He sold it to local farmers to put on their roads because they would wash away and get muddy in the winter, so it kind of helped the roads. The second thing he would do is that he would sell it to municipalities for parks and decoration, not a whole lot there. And then the third thing he would do is he would sold it to a lot of the cemetery owners because they had drainage issues, and that would help with all the drainage. So that's kind of where he starts there. Now, what is good? What is sand and gravel good for at that time? Like I said, not a whole lot of anything. Not a whole lot of anything until April of 1909. What happened in April of 1909? The city of Detroit decides to pave the first road, which was Woodward Avenue, between 6 and 7 Mile, okay? And people say to me, well, wait a minute, there were paved roads before April of 1909, and that's correct. We had asphalt technology up until the late 1800s, but it wasn't until April of 1909 they started paving a road with concrete that had a curing process, as you can see over here, right? So prior to the trains, you had horse paths that carts and buggies would come through like this, right? Here the train's actually here on the side. And when the trains came to town, they laid the tracks right down the middle, and all the horse and wagons and oxen and cart had to go on the sides of them. And as you can see here, it would get super muddy, super thick. In the wintertime, it would get really muddy and impassable. They couldn't get through. And then in the summertime, they would wash out and get really rutted. And then a gentleman, you may have heard of him, his name's Henry Ford. He started the horseless carriage, as he called it, but then of course we call it the automobile. And the automobile was the same thing. They had to drive on the sides of the railroad tracks. And then get rutted out in the summertime, and they'd break their wooden wheels all the time, and they were getting frustrated. So in April of 1909, the city of Detroit decides to pave Woodward Avenue between 6 and 7 Mile, and here's that concrete they're laying right here. And this is the final product. Here's the railroad track, and this is the pavement right here they put. Yeah. You can see some potholes. It's not uncommon as you see today, right? They're probably filling these cracks every summer, right? So they're driving on it, and they even put the arch in the middle. See how the cars are kind of leaning? They put the arch in the middle so the water would wash off. Needless to say, they drove on it and they said, this is amazing. This is the best road we've ever driven on. We should pave everything in Detroit. Let's pave the roads, sidewalks, building foundations, sewer lines. And what do you need for concrete? Sand and gravel, right? So Oxford begins to take off. So we talked about William Smith as being the first person to crush. But after the city of Detroit and Michigan in general with bridges and things like that, once they start requiring more sand and gravel to make concrete, that brings more people to Oxford to get involved in the sand and gravel company. So the second person to get involved was a gentleman by the name of Fred Ward. Okay, now Fred Ward was part of the Ward family, and they were involved in the timber industry in the UP. So when a cow kicked over a lantern and burned down Chicago, or whatever actually happened, we don't know, right? They basically put all their lumber on barges and shipped it down Lake Michigan to Chicago and became millionaires overnight. So when he came to Oxford, he had moolah. He had a lot of money. He wasn't like everybody else. William Smith started out with these steamer shovels, like a clamshell, and they would dig down there, and then he would drop it on the ground, and upwards of 50 men would shovel it into train cars, and then horses or donkeys would pull those train cars all the way over to the train tracks to hook them up, and they could then ship it out. The difference is, like I said, he had a lot of money. So he actually, in 1920, spent $1 million helping to invent the hydraulic suction pump. It's the same technology we use today. It's a pump that can suck sand and gravel from upwards of 65 feet under the water. Now, instead of putting it on the ground, he had 2 miles of train side tracks that came into his gravel pit, so the trains were right there, and he had over 3 miles of electric conveyor belts that nobody else had. They were moving sand and gravel in cars with donkeys and horses, and he could move it really fast with speed through his gravel pit with electric conveyor belts. Like I said, he had a lot of money. So on average, it would take one man, 1 full day of work to fill a train car. Now, it wasn't just one person doing it. They had multiple people doing it. He bragged in 1923, I could fill a train car in 10 seconds. And of course, everyone's laughed and said, oh yeah, right, let's see that. He said, come on out. So he brought the newspaper out, the Oxford Leader came out, and he pointed all of his conveyor belts, all of them into one gravel car, and he filled it up in about 10 seconds. And so to give you an idea, he started out doing 2 to 3 train cars a day on day one. He ended up doing 500 and 600 train cars towards the peak of that. Now, if you go on Lakeville Road, east of town, on the south side of the road, this was his pit right here. Today, it's called Oxford Lake, right? It was a 300-acre gravel pit. Today, it's a 115-acre lake, 50 feet at its deepest. There is a crushing plant in the bottom of it. And on the north side, you have Koenig, which is still in business today, mining lots of sand and gravel. But that was his pit down here. He mined that until he sold it to another company, and that company had it for a year or two and then sold it to American Aggregates, who mined it for a few more years in the 40s until they were done with it, and then all they did was tap it into the water supply and filled it up, and it became Ward's Lake or Crescent Lake at times, and today it's Oxford Lake with Oxford Lake subdivision that surrounds it. But Koenig, I can tell you, is still in operation today, right? And when they came in 1924, they were on East Drainer Road. And then in 1926, they bought the property on Lakeville Road and moved their operations there. Now, to give you an idea,